During the spring of 1995, in a quiet community in North Carolina, a young woman went missing without warning, and police found no evidence. 18 years later, one small detail reopened the case, and it exposed a dark secret. The coastline of North Carolina is famous for its warm, crowded beaches during the summer months, but during the early days of March, the landscape is entirely different. The tourist crowds have not yet arrived. The coastal towns are mostly empty. The seas are usually a pale shade of gray, and the freezing winds blowing off the Atlantic Ocean make the beaches feel incredibly isolated. It is a quiet, beautiful, and lonely place. For 20-year-old Harper Bennett, this quiet isolation was exactly what she was looking for. Harper was a sophomore at a university in a busy, crowded city. While most of her classmates spent their spring break traveling to loud, tropical parties, Harper wanted nothing to do with the chaos. She was a deeply observant, gentle young woman with a profound passion for nature photography. She viewed the world through the lens of her camera, always looking for the quiet moments that other people simply walked right past. Harper was the kind of daughter who called her mother, Evelyn, every single Sunday without fail. Evelyn was a single mother who had worked 2 jobs to afford Harper's college tuition. The two of them shared an incredibly close, unbreakable bond. Before Harper left for college, Evelyn had given her a custom-made silver necklace. It was a beautiful, functioning miniature compass resting inside a silver locket. Evelyn told her that no matter how far she traveled, the compass would always point her back home. Harper never took the necklace off. For her spring break in 1995, Harper and her best friend Maya decided to rent a small, weathered wooden cabin on the very edge of Oak Island, North Carolina. The cabin was cheap because it was the off-season, and it sat completely alone on a long, empty stretch of sand dunes. When the two girls arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, the weather was bitterly cold, but Harper was absolutely thrilled. The crashing gray waves, the tall sea oats bending in the wind, and the empty horizon were perfect subjects for her photography portfolio. As they were unloading their heavy bags from the car, they were greeted by a local handyman named Mitchell Cross. Mitchell was a tall, rugged man in his late 30s who worked odd jobs around the island. He was holding a hammer, fixing a few loose boards on the cabin's front porch. He was polite, offering to carry their heaviest suitcase inside, and he spoke with a warm, easygoing coastal accent. Mitchell gave the girls a few tips about the island, pointing down the long, empty beach. He told them about an old, abandoned concrete watchtower sitting about a mile down the coastline. He said that, when the sun set, the light hitting the old concrete made for a beautiful photograph. Harper thanked him, completely fascinated by the idea, and Mitchell packed up his tools and drove away in his rusted pickup truck. For the first 2 days, the trip was perfectly peaceful. Harper and Maya spent their time drinking hot tea, reading books wrapped in heavy blankets, and walking along the shoreline. Harper took hundreds of photographs, capturing the seagulls, the driftwood, and the crashing waves. She called her mother on Wednesday evening, her voice bright and full of genuine happiness. She told Evelyn about the cabin, the freezing wind, and how much she was looking forward to developing her film in the college darkroom. It was a normal, comforting conversation between a mother and a daughter. Evelyn told Harper to stay warm and promised to make her favorite dinner when she got back to the city. Then came the evening of Thursday, March 9. It was their last full night on the island. The afternoon had been completely overcast, but around 4 o'clock, the heavy clouds began to break, revealing the promise of a brilliant, vibrant sunset. Maya was exhausted from a long walk they had taken earlier in the day. She laid down on the living room couch, pulling a heavy quilt over her shoulders, and quickly fell asleep to the sound of the ocean wind rattling the windows. Harper, however, saw the changing light and immediately grabbed her heavy canvas camera bag. She put on her bright yellow raincoat, zipping it all the way up to block the bitter wind. She looked at Maya sleeping peacefully on the couch and quietly wrote a short note on a piece of paper, leaving it on the kitchen counter. The note simply said she was walking down to the old watchtower to catch the sunset and that she would be back before it got completely dark. Harper grabbed her keys, stepped out onto the wooden porch, and pulled the front door shut behind her. She walked down the wooden stairs, her boots hitting the soft sand, and began the 1-mile walk down the completely empty coastline toward the concrete tower. Back in the cabin, Maya slept deeply, lulled by the rhythmic sound of the crashing waves. When she finally opened her eyes, the cabin was completely pitch black. The fire in the small wood stove had died out, leaving the room freezing cold. Maya sat up, rubbing her eyes, and looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:30 in the evening. Maya called out Harper's name, assuming her friend was in the bedroom or the kitchen. The house was entirely silent, except for the aggressive howling of the wind outside. Maya turned on a small table lamp, casting a dim, yellow glow across the living room. She walked into the kitchen and saw the handwritten note resting on the counter. She read the words, and a small knot of unease began to form in her stomach. The sunset had happened hours ago. It was now completely dark, freezing, and the tide had come in aggressively. Maya walked to the front door and opened it. A blast of freezing, salty air hit her in the face. She stepped out onto the porch and looked down the beach. The coastline was swallowed in absolute, terrifying darkness. There were no streetlights, no other houses, and no signs of a flashlight beam cutting through the night. The ocean roared loudly, violent and unpredictable in the high tide. Maya grabbed her own coat and a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer. She walked down to the edge of the water, shouting Harper's name as loud as she possibly could. The wind completely devoured her voice. She aimed the beam of her flashlight down the beach toward where the old watchtower was supposed to be, but the light only reached a few dozen feet before fading into the blackness. Panic slowly began to replace her unease. Harper was a responsible, deeply cautious person. She would never stay out on a freezing, unlit beach for hours by herself. Maya ran back into the cabin, picked up the heavy landline phone, and dialed 911. Her hands were shaking violently as she told the emergency dispatcher that her friend had gone for a walk hours ago and had completely vanished into the dark. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Within 30 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 local police cruisers cut through the darkness, pulling up into the sandy driveway of the cabin. A veteran investigator named Sheriff Dawson stepped out of his vehicle, pulling his heavy jacket tight against the bitter wind. Maya was standing on the porch, crying and shivering, holding Harper's handwritten note. Sheriff Dawson organized an immediate search. He and his deputies walked down the beach, using powerful halogen spotlights to illuminate the sand. They walked the entire mile down to the abandoned concrete watchtower. The structure was cold, empty, and covered in graffiti. They searched the dunes, they searched the shoreline, and they shouted Harper's name until their voices were entirely hoarse. But as they swept the area near the edge of the water, one of the deputies called Sheriff Dawson over. The tide was pulling back slightly, and in the wet sand, just a few feet from the crashing, freezing waves, the deputy pointed his light at a single set of boot prints. The prints faced the ocean, and then they simply disappeared, entirely washed away by the high tide. Sheriff Dawson looked at the dark, violent ocean, and a heavy, tragic realization settled over him. But as he looked back toward the empty, endless stretch of sand, the most terrifying question remained completely unanswered. Harper had walked down this beach to take photographs, but if she had simply slipped into the water, why was her heavy canvas camera bag nowhere to be found? The sun rising over Oak Island on Friday morning brought a pale, weak daylight that revealed a massive, coordinated search effort. The freezing, empty beach was suddenly swarming with activity. Sheriff Dawson had called in the United States Coast Guard, who deployed a low-flying search helicopter and 2 small rescue boats to scan the churning gray waters of the Atlantic. Dozens of local volunteers, wrapped in heavy winter coats, formed long lines across the sand dunes, using long wooden walking sticks to poke through the thick sea oats and washed-up driftwood. But as the hours dragged on, the brutal, unyielding reality of the ocean began to settle heavily over the investigators. The prevailing theory among the local police was tragically simple. The concrete watchtower sat precariously close to the water's edge, surrounded by jagged, slippery rocks that were constantly pounded by the high tide. The authorities believed that Harper, focused entirely on getting the perfect photograph of the sunset, had ventured too close to the rocks, slipped on the wet stone, and been pulled under by the freezing, violent undertow. The fact that her heavy canvas camera bag was completely missing seemed to strongly support this theory. The ocean, they reasoned, had simply swallowed her and her equipment, washing it all out to sea. But Sheriff Dawson, a man who had worked the coastline for over 20 years, felt a deep, nagging sense of unease. He stood on the beach, staring at the single set of boot prints near the water line. The prints didn't show signs of slipping or sliding. They just walked forward and stopped. And while the ocean was incredibly powerful, Dawson knew that heavy canvas bags rarely just floated away without leaving a strap or a torn piece of fabric washed up on the shoreline in the following days. Still, without any other physical evidence, he had to treat it as a tragic drowning. Back in the city, 300 miles away, Evelyn Bennett was sitting at her small kitchen table, drinking a cup of black coffee and preparing for her morning shift at the bakery. When the heavy landline phone attached to the kitchen wall began to ring, she answered it with her usual warm, tired smile. But when she heard Sheriff Dawson's deep, somber voice on the other end, introducing himself and asking if she was Harper's mother, the ceramic coffee mug slipped completely through her fingers. It shattered against the linoleum floor, sending hot coffee splashing across the wooden cabinets. Evelyn did not pack a bag. She did not call her boss to explain. She simply grabbed her car keys, ran out the front door, and drove for 5 hours straight, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles physically ached. The entire drive was a terrifying blur of highway lines and blinding, suffocating panic. She prayed out loud in the empty car, begging the universe to keep her daughter safe, desperately hoping this was all just a terrible, chaotic misunderstanding. When Evelyn finally pulled her car into the sandy driveway of the wooden cabin, the scene broke her heart into 1,000 pieces. Yellow police tape was strung across the porch. Maya was sitting in the back of an open ambulance, wrapped in a heavy thermal blanket, shivering and crying uncontrollably. Evelyn ran across the sand, completely ignoring the deputies who tried to hold her back. She grabbed Maya in a desperate, crushing hug. Maya sobbed heavily into Evelyn's shoulder, apologizing over and over again for falling asleep on the couch, blaming herself for letting Harper walk out the door alone. Evelyn hushed her, holding the young girl tightly, her own tears falling hot and fast into the freezing coastal wind. Sheriff Dawson gently pulled Evelyn aside, walking her down to the edge of the beach. He softly explained the police theory, pointing out the jagged rocks near the distant watchtower and talking about the dangerous, unpredictable undertow of the coastal tide. But Evelyn vehemently shook her head, completely rejecting the detective's words. She told Dawson that Harper was not a careless girl. She was deeply respectful of the ocean. She hated swimming in cold water, and she would absolutely never climb onto wet, slippery rocks just to get a photograph. She was cautious, calculated, and incredibly smart. She didn't fall, Evelyn stated, her voice trembling but carrying an unbreakable maternal certainty. Somebody was out here. Somebody took her. You have to find out who was on this beach. Driven by Evelyn's fierce insistence, Sheriff Dawson expanded the scope of the investigation. He recognized that the beach was heavily isolated, meaning anyone who encountered Harper would likely have a specific, undeniable reason for being on the island during the off-season. The detectives brought Maya into the station for a detailed interview, carefully walking her through every single moment of their trip. They asked about anyone they had met, anyone who had looked at them strangely at the local gas station, or anyone who knew they were staying alone in the rented cabin. Maya immediately mentioned the handyman, Mitchell Cross. She told the detectives that Mitchell had been fixing the porch when they arrived, and more importantly, he was the exact person who had told Harper about the abandoned concrete watchtower. He had explicitly mentioned how beautiful the sunset looked hitting the old concrete, practically handing Harper the idea for her evening walk. Sheriff Dawson brought Mitchell Cross into the small island precinct the very next morning. Mitchell arrived wearing dirty work boots and a faded flannel shirt, looking genuinely concerned and deeply cooperative. He took off his baseball cap, sitting heavily in the wooden chair across from Dawson, and answered every single question without hesitation. He admitted that he had suggested the watchtower to the girls, explaining that he was just trying to be friendly and point out a good spot for a young photographer. When asked where he was on Thursday evening between 5 o'clock and 9 o'clock, Mitchell's alibi was completely airtight. He told Dawson that he had finished his work on the island early and had driven his rusted pickup truck back to the mainland. At exactly 6 o'clock, he had walked into a crowded local tavern to play pool in a weekly amateur league. The detectives immediately sent deputies to the tavern to verify his story. The results were incredibly frustrating. The bartender, the owner of the tavern, and at least a dozen different patrons completely corroborated Mitchell's timeline. They swore he had been standing by the pool tables, drinking beer and laughing with his friends from 6 in the evening until closing time. The tavern was a 40-minute drive from the island cabin. It was physically impossible for Mitchell Cross to have been standing on the freezing beach at sunset. He was completely cleared as a suspect. The police hit a massive, unyielding brick wall. They tracked down the few other residents who lived on the island year-round, checked local traffic cameras on the mainland bridge, and ran the license plates of every car that had received a parking ticket near the beaches that week. They found absolutely nothing. There were no strange vehicles, no witnesses walking their dogs, and no reported disturbances. Harper Bennett had walked down the shoreline and seemingly evaporated into the dark gray sky. As the weeks turned into months, the harsh coastal winter melted into the bright, busy summer. The tourist crowds flooded back onto Oak Island. The beaches filled with colorful umbrellas, laughing children, and loud music. The tragedy of the missing college student faded into a local whisper, completely buried under the noise of the vacation season. The missing person flyers taped to the windows of the local bait shops slowly curled in the humid sun, their ink fading until Harper's smiling face was barely visible. Evelyn Bennett was eventually forced to return to her life in the city, but she left her heart permanently on the freezing beach. She kept Harper's bedroom exactly the way she had left it. The bed was perfectly made, her textbooks were stacked neatly on the desk, and her favorite winter coats hung in the closet. Evelyn continued to pay Harper's cellular phone bill every single month, just in case her daughter ever found a way to call home. She lived in the agonizing, suffocating limbo of ambiguous loss, refusing to hold a memorial service because she absolutely refused to believe her daughter was dead. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. The investigation officially went cold, sitting in a locked filing cabinet in Sheriff Dawson's office. He was a good man, and the unsolved mystery haunted him. Every time he drove his police cruiser past the empty stretch of beach near the old concrete watchtower, he would slow down, scanning the sand dunes, wondering how he had failed to find a single trace of the young woman. Then, in late August, nearly 5 months after Harper had vanished, the island was hit by a massive, late-summer tropical storm. The high winds and powerful tidal surges aggressively reshaped the coastline, violently carving away massive sections of the tall sand dunes that sat deep behind the high tide line. 2 days after the storm passed, a local teenager was walking his golden retriever along the freshly eroded dunes, completely off the beaten path and nearly half a mile inland from the concrete watchtower. The dog suddenly broke away from the teenager, running toward a steep, collapsed wall of wet sand. The dog began digging frantically, barking loudly at something buried deep beneath the thick roots of the sea oats. The teenager jogged over, pulling the dog back by its heavy nylon leash. He looked down into the freshly dug hole and saw a thick, heavy canvas strap sticking out of the wet sand. He reached down and pulled on it. After a few seconds of heavy resistance, a large object broke free from the sand. It was a dark green canvas bag. It was completely encrusted with dried salt and sand, but the heavy brass buckles were still intact. The teenager, completely unaware of the dark history of the island, unbuckled the top flap and looked inside, hoping to find something valuable. But when he saw the name Harper Bennett, written in thick black marker on a small luggage tag stitched into the inner lining, he immediately dropped the bag and ran back to his house to call the police. Sheriff Dawson arrived at the scene within 20 minutes. His heart hammered violently in his chest as he approached the canvas bag resting on the sand. The discovery instantly and completely destroyed the police department's original theory. The bag had not been washed out to sea. It had not been lost to the undertow. It had been carried half a mile inland, completely away from the water, and deliberately, deeply buried in the dry sand dunes to hide it from the search parties. Dawson put on a pair of latex gloves and carefully opened the heavy canvas flap. The interior of the bag was mostly empty. Harper's expensive camera, her specialized lenses, and her wallet were completely gone. The killer had likely stolen them to pawn for cash or kept them as a sick trophy. But as Dawson ran his gloved fingers along the deep, dark corners of the bag, he felt a small, hard cylinder tucked completely out of sight in a hidden side pocket. He pulled it out, holding it up into the bright summer sunlight. It was a single, tightly rolled canister of undeveloped camera film. Dawson did not wait for the state forensic lab. He drove the roll of film directly to a trusted, professional photo lab in the nearby city, ordering the technician to develop the negatives with absolute, painstaking care. The salt and moisture had degraded some of the film, but the chemicals inside the small black canister had preserved the images surprisingly well. Dawson stood in the darkroom, the red light casting a heavy shadow over his face, watching as the photographs slowly materialized in the chemical bath. The first few pictures were exactly what he expected: beautiful, haunting black and white shots of the crashing waves, a dead tree branch buried in the sand, and seagulls flying over the water. But it was the very last photograph on the roll, taken just minutes before Harper disappeared into the dark, that made the breath completely leave Sheriff Dawson's lungs. The photograph showed the old, abandoned concrete watchtower bathed in the fading light of the sunset. Harper had captured the exact angle Mitchell Cross had described, but standing perfectly still in the deep, dark shadow directly behind the concrete wall of the tower, completely hidden from the beach but clearly visible from the angle Harper had shot from, was a large, dark-colored pickup truck. And leaning against the hood of the truck, staring directly into the camera lens with his arms crossed over his chest, was the distinct, unmistakable silhouette of a heavily built man. Sheriff Dawson stood in the dim, red glow of the professional photo darkroom, his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared at the final photograph. The image was a terrifying, frozen testament to Harper's final moments on Earth. She had walked down to the abandoned concrete watchtower, believing she was entirely alone on the freezing, empty beach. But the photograph proved with absolute, chilling certainty that a predator had been waiting for her in the shadows. Dawson immediately sent the negative to the state police laboratory, demanding that their forensic imaging department enhance the photograph. He desperately needed to see the man's face, or at the very least, read the license plate of the dark-colored pickup truck sitting behind the concrete wall. But when the lab results came back a week later, the crushing reality of the situation completely paralyzed the investigation. Because Harper had aimed her lens directly toward the vibrant, setting sun, the harsh backlighting had completely washed out the details of the shadows. The intense lens flare turned the man leaning against the truck into a solid, featureless black silhouette. The truck itself, was a generic, dark-colored model from the late 1980s, a vehicle that thousands of people drove in the coastal Carolinas. The license plate was hidden entirely by a patch of tall sea oats. The police tried to track down anyone in the county who drove a similar dark truck, but without a clear plate number or a description of the driver's face, it was an impossible task. They interviewed Mitchell Cross again, but his rusted pickup was a completely different make and color, and his alibi remained absolutely perfect. The photograph, which was the greatest clue they had ever found, was simultaneously a massive, unbreakable dead end. The investigation slowly ground to a devastating halt. The massive command center was dismantled. The police tape was removed from the wooden cabin on the dunes. Harper Bennett was officially listed as a missing person, and the file was placed into a heavy metal cabinet in the archives. 18 long, agonizing years passed. The world moved forward into the year 2013. The small coastal towns of North Carolina grew larger, building new hotels and massive beachfront homes to accommodate the booming tourist industry. The abandoned concrete watchtower eventually crumbled into the ocean, reclaimed by the violent tides. Maya, Harper's best friend, eventually graduated, married, and had children of her own, but she never stopped carrying the suffocating, heavy guilt of falling asleep on the couch that afternoon. For Evelyn Bennett, time simply stopped moving in the spring of 1995. 18 years is an incredibly long time to live in the dark. Her hair turned a soft, elegant shade of silver, and the deep lines of unending grief etched themselves permanently around her eyes. She still lived in the exact same city apartment. She still kept Harper's bedroom door open, carefully dusting the wooden desk and keeping the textbooks neatly stacked. She never changed her phone number, and she still paid the monthly bill for a cellular phone that had gone dead nearly 2 decades ago. Evelyn lived in the torturous, quiet limbo of a mother who simply refused to say goodbye. Sheriff Dawson eventually reached the mandatory retirement age. He handed in his badge and his uniform, but he never truly let the case go. He kept a small, laminated copy of Harper's final photograph tucked inside his leather wallet. Every time he walked into a local diner or drove past a dark-colored pickup truck, his eyes would instinctively scan the faces of the men around him, wondering if the monster was sitting right there in plain sight. He passed the official case file down to a younger, fiercely determined investigator named Detective Carter. Carter respected the history of the case, checking the national databases every month, but for 18 years, the file remained entirely silent. Then, in the late autumn of 2013, a massive, incredibly destructive hurricane slammed into the North Carolina coast. The brutal storm surge completely reshaped the geography of the mainland marshes, ripping up deep layers of mud and sand that had sat undisturbed for decades. A few weeks after the storm passed, an amateur metal detectorist named Thomas was walking the muddy, overgrown banks of the Blackwood estuary. The estuary was a massive, maze-like network of saltwater marshes and deep, murky inlets located nearly 10 miles inland from the island where Harper had vanished. It was an incredibly isolated area, mostly used by local crab fishermen and completely inaccessible by large boats. Thomas was sweeping his metal detector slowly over a freshly exposed bank of dark, thick mud when his machine suddenly emitted a sharp, high-pitched scream. He dropped to his knees, using a small hand trowel to dig through the freezing, wet clay. About 8 inches down, his trowel scraped against something solid. He pulled the object out of the mud, wiping it carefully on the leg of his jeans. It was a delicate, heavy silver necklace. Thomas walked down to the water's edge and rinsed the dark mud away. The jewelry was heavily tarnished, but the detailed craftsmanship was still stunning. It was a locket that opened to reveal a functioning, miniature compass. The glass over the compass dial was cracked, and the needle was completely rusted in place. Thomas turned the silver locket over in his muddy hands. Engraved deeply into the back of the silver casing was a short, beautiful sentence. To Harper, always find your way home. Thomas, who had lived in the coastal county his entire life, instantly remembered the legendary cold case of the missing college student. His heart began to hammer in his chest. He didn't put the necklace in his pocket. He immediately walked back to his truck, drove straight to the county police precinct, and placed the muddy silver compass directly onto Detective Carter's desk. Detective Carter stared at the engraved silver necklace, an electric jolt of adrenaline shooting through his entire body. He immediately called retired Sheriff Dawson, who rushed down to the station within 20 minutes. When Dawson saw the necklace sitting in the plastic evidence bag, his eyes completely filled with tears. Carter picked up the phone and made the call Evelyn Bennett had been waiting 18 years to receive. When Evelyn arrived at the coastal police station later that evening, Carter gently slid the plastic bag across the table. Evelyn placed her trembling hand over the plastic, letting out a sharp, agonizing gasp. She recognized the compass instantly. It was the exact necklace she had placed around her daughter's neck before she left for college. But the discovery of the necklace did not just bring emotional closure. It provided the police with a massive, undeniable geographical clue. Detective Carter and Sheriff Dawson spread a massive topographical map of the county across the briefing room table. Thomas showed them the exact, specific muddy bank in the Blackwood estuary, where he had dug the necklace out of the earth. Dawson stared at the map, his mind racing. The estuary was incredibly secluded. It was surrounded by miles of dense, impassable marsh grass. The killer had clearly thrown the necklace into the deep water to destroy the evidence, never expecting a massive hurricane to dredge the bottom of the inlet 18 years later. If he threw it into this specific inlet, Carter said, pointing a red pen at the map, he had to have accessed the water from somewhere nearby. You can't just hike through this marsh. You would sink up to your knees in the mud. Carter quickly pulled up the county property records for the land directly bordering the small, isolated inlet. There was only one property that had direct, deep-water access to that exact spot. It was a massive, sprawling plot of land registered as Sullivan Salvage and Marine. It was an old, defunct auto and boat scrapyard that had officially gone out of business and closed its gates in 1998, just 3 years after Harper disappeared. The property was owned by a man named Victor Sullivan, a quiet, solitary local who had inherited the land from his family. According to the tax records, Victor had completely vanished from the county shortly after closing the business, leaving the property to rot in the harsh coastal weather. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Detective Carter didn't waste a single second. He immediately secured an emergency, wide-sweeping search warrant for the entire 20-acre property of the abandoned salvage yard. The next morning, under a heavy, overcast sky, a massive convoy of police vehicles and tactical forensic units turned off the main coastal highway and drove down a long, severely overgrown gravel road. The road was flanked by towering pine trees and dense, thorny brush, leading them completely away from civilization. When they arrived at the heavy chain-link gates of Sullivan Salvage, the officers had to use industrial bolt cutters to snap the rusted padlocks. The tactical team pushed the heavy gates open and stepped into an incredibly eerie, terrifying graveyard of rusted metal. The sprawling property was completely swallowed by nature. Tall marsh grasses and thick green vines crawled over dozens of decaying cars, crushed boat hulls, and towering stacks of oxidized tires. The air smelled strongly of stagnant saltwater, old engine oil, and wet rust. The silence was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of the wind, rattling the loose metal roofs of the collapsing storage sheds. Detective Carter and a team of 20 officers formed a wide grid, walking slowly and methodically through the dangerous, jagged maze of the scrapyard. They were looking for anything that might connect Victor Sullivan to the empty beach in 1995. For 3 exhausting hours, they searched the rotting boat cabins and the crushed vehicles, finding absolutely nothing but snake skins and rat nests. The property was massive, and the thick vegetation made it nearly impossible to see more than 10 feet in any direction. But as Detective Carter pushed his way through a thick wall of dense, thorny vines near the very back of the property, right on the muddy edge of the dark estuary water, he suddenly stopped. Hidden entirely behind a massive, collapsing wooden boat hull was a vehicle. It was not crushed, and it was not stacked on top of other cars. It was parked deliberately on a flat patch of concrete, completely covered by a massive, heavy-duty dark green canvas tarp. The tarp was severely weathered, covered in moss and dead leaves, suggesting the vehicle had been hidden there for nearly 2 decades. Carter called out to the rest of the team. The officers quickly converged on the back corner of the lot. With their hearts pounding, 3 deputies grabbed the edges of the heavy, wet canvas tarp and pulled it backward. The heavy fabric slid off the vehicle, falling into the muddy grass with a wet thud. Carter completely lost his breath. Sitting on the concrete pad, its paint heavily faded and its tires completely flat and dry-rotted, was a dark blue pickup truck. It was a late 1980s model. Carter immediately pulled the laminated photograph of Harper's final picture from his jacket pocket. He held the photograph up, comparing the silhouette in the picture to the vehicle sitting directly in front of him. The body style, the rusted chrome bumper, and the cracked side mirror were an absolutely perfect, undeniable match. This was the exact truck that had been parked behind the concrete watchtower on the night Harper Bennett vanished. The forensic team immediately rushed forward. They dusted the heavy metal door handle, but 18 years of humidity had destroyed any fingerprints. Carter grabbed the handle and pulled aggressively. The heavy door squealed in protest, but the locking mechanism had completely rusted through. The door popped open, revealing the dusty, foul-smelling interior of the cab. Carter shined his heavy flashlight inside. The seats were cracked and covered in a thick layer of dust, but resting perfectly on the passenger side floorboard, partially hidden under an old, faded piece of newspaper, was a bulky, dark object. Carter put on a pair of latex gloves, leaned into the truck, and carefully lifted the object out. It was a highly specialized, expensive camera attached to a heavy professional zoom lens. The leather neck strap was completely dry-rotted, but the camera itself was fully intact. Tucked directly beneath the camera in the floorboard was a small, faded leather wallet. Carter flipped the wallet open. Looking back at him from behind a cloudy plastic window was Harper Bennett's official university student identification card. The discovery was absolutely monumental. The killer hadn't thrown her belongings into the ocean. He had taken her camera bag back to the scrapyard, stolen the valuable equipment, and buried the empty canvas bag in the sand dunes to throw the police completely off his trail. Victor Sullivan was the monster hiding behind the concrete tower. But as Carter's flashlight beam swept across the dusty dashboard of the rusted truck, it illuminated one final, terrifying object resting in the center console. It was a heavy, rusted iron key. It was not a car key, and it was not a standard house key. It was a massive, antique skeleton key attached to a heavy steel ring. Carter grabbed the key, backing out of the truck. He looked around the immediate area. Just 30 feet away from the hidden truck, sitting dangerously close to the muddy bank of the estuary, was a small, windowless cinder block building. It looked like an old pump house or a mechanical storage shed. The heavy wooden door of the building was secured by a massive, antique iron lock that perfectly matched the size of the key in his hand. Carter drew his service weapon, nodding to the tactical team. 2 heavily armed officers stacked up on either side of the wooden door. Carter stepped forward, inserting the heavy iron key into the rusted lock. With a loud, grinding crack, the heavy metal tumblers turned. Carter pulled the heavy wooden door open. The officers immediately aimed their bright tactical flashlights into the pitch-black darkness of the cinderblock room. The interior of the building was entirely empty of mechanical equipment. The walls were completely bare concrete, but directly in the center of the dusty, concrete floor, illuminated in the blinding white beams of the police flashlights, was a massive, heavy iron trapdoor set deeply into the foundation. The trapdoor was secured by three massive, modern steel padlocks, and leading from the edge of the trapdoor, running directly toward the muddy banks of the dark water outside, was a terrifyingly clear set of deep, heavy drag marks permanently scarred into the concrete floor. The heavy iron trapdoor in the center of the cinderblock building was covered in a thick layer of dust and rusted around the edges, but the three modern steel padlocks securing it were entirely out of place. Detective Carter stepped back, signaling the tactical breacher to move forward. The deafening, sharp cracks of the heavy hydraulic bolt cutters snapping the thick steel locks echoed violently inside the small, windowless room. Carter holstered his flashlight for a moment, grabbing the rusted iron ring handle of the trapdoor with both hands. He planted his boots firmly on the concrete floor and pulled upward with every ounce of his strength. The heavy metal door let out a loud, grinding shriek as it slowly swung open on its rusted hinges, exposing a dark, square shaft leading straight down into the earth. A rush of incredibly stale, freezing air blew up out of the hole. It smelled of damp soil, old rust, and the unmistakable, suffocating scent of chemical bleach. Carter drew his service weapon, switched his heavy tactical flashlight back on, and pointed the bright white beam down into the darkness. A rusted iron ladder was bolted into the side of the concrete shaft, descending about 15 feet into a subterranean room. The tactical team moved in perfect, silent coordination. Carter climbed down the ladder first, his boots echoing loudly in the enclosed space, followed closely by three heavily armed officers. When Carter's boots hit the solid concrete floor at the bottom of the shaft, he raised his flashlight and swept the beam across the room. It was a windowless, underground holding cell, roughly 10 feet wide and 15 feet long. The walls were made of thick, reinforced cinder blocks, designed to completely muffle any sound from reaching the surface. The room was entirely empty of human life, but the objects left behind painted a picture of unimaginable, terrifying captivity. In the corner of the room sat a heavy metal cot, bolted directly into the concrete floor. Attached to the rusted frame of the bed was a thick, heavy steel chain ending in a leather shackle. Sitting next to the bed was a plastic bucket and a few empty, dry-rotted plastic water jugs. But it was what Carter saw resting on the center of the bare mattress that made the breath completely leave his lungs. It was a piece of bright yellow, waterproof fabric. It was severely torn and covered in old, dark stains, but the material was absolutely undeniable. It was the shredded remains of the heavy yellow raincoat Harper Bennett had been wearing on the night she walked out of the beach cabin. Carter slowly approached the concrete wall directly above the metal cot. The harsh, bright beam of his flashlight illuminated a series of deep, frantic scratches carved directly into the cinder block. Someone had used a small, sharp piece of metal to meticulously scrape a message into the hard stone. Carter stared at the carving, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The message was short, but the words carried a devastating, history-altering weight. Harper B. I am still alive. March 1998. The discovery completely shattered the entire timeline of the 18-year-old cold case. Harper Bennett had not drowned in the ocean in 1995. She had not been killed on the night she was taken. Victor Sullivan had ambushed her by the concrete watchtower, driven her back to his isolated scrapyard, and locked her inside this dark, underground hell. And the carving proved, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that Harper had survived in this pitch-black room for at least 3 full years, while the police, the Coast Guard, and her own mother were desperately searching the beaches just 10 miles away. But 1998 was the exact year Victor Sullivan abruptly closed his lucrative salvage business, and completely vanished from the county tax records. Carter spun around, shining his flashlight back toward the heavy iron ladder leading up to the surface. He thought about the deep, heavy drag marks permanently scarred into the concrete floor of the pump house above. The drag marks did not lead to a grave. They ran in a perfectly straight line from the edge of the trapdoor directly toward the muddy banks of the Deepwater estuary outside. In 1998, Victor Sullivan didn't kill Harper to cover his tracks. He had packed up his horrific, hidden life, dragged a heavy transport crate out of the pump house, loaded it onto a private boat, and moved his entire operation to a completely new, untraceable location. He had taken her with him. Detective Carter rushed back up the iron ladder, bursting out of the cinderblock building into the gray coastal daylight. He immediately grabbed his police radio, calling the precinct captain to organize a massive, unprecedented interagency task force. This was no longer a cold case recovery mission. It was an active, violently urgent hostage rescue operation. The victim was not just a missing college student anymore. She was a woman who had endured unimaginable torment, and there was a desperate, burning chance that she was still alive. When Detective Carter called Evelyn Bennett to explain the carving found in the underground cell, the mother's reaction was a devastating mixture of profound horror and blinding, ferocious hope. To learn that her gentle, artistic daughter had suffered in the dark for years was a pain too massive to comprehend, but to know that Harper was strong enough to carve her name into the stone, to know that she had fought to survive, ignited a fire in Evelyn's soul. She refused to sit in her apartment. She drove straight back to the coastal police station, sitting quietly in the briefing room, refusing to sleep until the police found the monster who had stolen her child. The investigative team poured every single resource they had into tracking Victor Sullivan's movements after 1998. They knew he had to have moved his operation by water, avoiding the highway stations and toll booths that would have recorded his license plates. The detectives subpoenaed the Deep Archive Maritime Registries for the entire state of North Carolina, looking for any vessel purchased or transferred by Victor Sullivan in the late 90s. The search initially yielded nothing. Victor had been incredibly careful, using cash and avoiding paper trails. But Detective Carter refused to hit another dead end. He pivoted the investigation, bringing in a forensic accountant to dig into the property taxes of the abandoned scrapyard. Even though the business was closed, someone had been quietly paying the minimum county property taxes every single year for 18 years to ensure the state didn't seize the land and discover the hidden truck. The accountant traced the annual tax payments to a deeply buried shell company called Coastal Marine Holdings, operating out of a P.O. box in a neighboring coastal county. When the detectives pulled the corporate registration for the shell company, they finally found the single, fatal mistake Victor Sullivan had made. Coastal Marine Holdings didn't just pay the taxes on the abandoned scrapyard. The shell company was also listed as the sole owner of a highly isolated, privately owned parcel of land known as Blackwood Reef. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Carter pulled up the maritime navigation charts for Blackwood Reef. The room went completely silent as the detectives stared at the map. Blackwood Reef was not a part of the mainland. It was a tiny, jagged, rocky island sitting 5 miles off the coast of North Carolina, completely surrounded by dangerous, swirling shoals and freezing, treacherous ocean currents. The island was so small it barely registered on modern GPS maps. In the 1920s, the federal government had built a massive, reinforced concrete lighthouse on the reef to guide shipping vessels away from the dangerous rocks. By the 1970s, the lighthouse was decommissioned, automated, and the surrounding keeper's cottage was sold off to private buyers. Victor Sullivan had used his shell company to buy a private island with a bomb-proof concrete lighthouse in the middle of the ocean. It was the ultimate, inescapable fortress. He had transported Harper across the dark water in 1998, locking her inside a structure where she could scream as loud as she wanted, and the only thing that would ever hear her was the crashing waves of the Atlantic. The Roanoke County Police Department instantly coordinated a massive, high-risk maritime raid. Because the island was surrounded by shallow, dangerous rocks, they couldn't use large Coast Guard cutters. They had to use specialized, blacked-out tactical Zodiac boats to approach the reef completely undetected in the dead of night. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the freezing coastal wind whipped across the dark ocean. Detective Carter, retired Sheriff Dawson, who had demanded to be on the lead boat, and a team of 20 heavily armed SWAT officers navigated the treacherous waters. The ocean was rough, the icy saltwater spraying over the bows of the Zodiacs as they cut through the pitch-black waves. In the distance, the towering, dark silhouette of the decommissioned concrete lighthouse loomed against the cloudy night sky, resembling a massive, silent tomb standing in the middle of the sea. The tactical boats killed their engines, silently drifting the last 100 yards until their rubber hulls scraped against the jagged rocks of the island. The officers stepped out into the freezing, knee-deep water, their assault rifles raised, using night vision goggles to scan the rocky terrain. The island was incredibly small, consisting only of the towering stone lighthouse and a long, low concrete keeper's cottage attached to its base. There was no boat tied to the crumbling wooden dock, meaning Victor Sullivan was either hiding inside or he had left the island completely. Carter and the tactical team moved silently up the slippery, moss-covered stone stairs toward the heavy wooden door of the keeper's cottage. The windows of the cottage were completely boarded up from the inside with thick steel plates, ensuring no light could escape and no one could look in. The only sound on the island was the rhythmic, deafening crash of the ocean waves against the reef. The breachers silently attached a hydraulic ram to the heavy front door. Carter held up his hand, his heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribcage. He dropped his hand. The hydraulic ram fired with a massive, violent crack. The heavy wooden door was instantly blown off its hinges, crashing inward onto the floor of the cottage. The SWAT officers flooded into the room, sweeping their bright white tactical lights across the space, shouting deafening commands for anyone inside to get on the ground. But the room was completely still. Carter stepped into the cottage, keeping his weapon raised. The interior of the building was shockingly clean and modern, powered by a quiet, humming diesel generator hidden somewhere on the island. The living room was comfortably furnished with bookshelves, a television, and a warm rug. It looked like the home of a quiet, retired fisherman. Sitting in a comfortable leather armchair in the center of the room, completely illuminated by the blinding tactical flashlights, was Victor Sullivan. He was an older man now, his hair completely white, wearing a thick wool sweater and heavy reading glasses. He did not jump when the door was blown open. He didn't reach for a weapon, and he didn't try to run. He simply sat in his chair, his hands resting calmly on his lap, staring at the heavily armed police officers with a terrifying, empty, and completely emotionless expression. "Victor Sullivan," Carter shouted, keeping his weapon aimed squarely at the man's chest. "Where is she? Where is Harper Bennett?" Victor did not say a single word. He slowly reached up, took off his reading glasses, and set them carefully on the small wooden table next to his chair. A cold, deeply unsettling smile slowly spread across his wrinkled face. It was the smile of a predator who knew he had built a maze no one else could solve. Carter felt a burning, desperate rage flare in his chest. The officers quickly moved in, violently pulling Victor out of the chair, slamming him against the wall and securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. They tore the cottage apart, kicking open the bedroom and bathroom doors, desperate to find the hidden room. But the cottage was entirely empty. There were no trapdoors in the floor, and there were no hidden passageways behind the bookshelves. Carter grabbed Victor by the collar of his sweater, his voice shaking with pure fury. "I know you brought her here in 1998. If you don't tell me where she is right now, I swear to God I will tear this entire island apart brick by brick." Victor just stared back at him, his dark eyes completely devoid of humanity. "You're 18 years too late, detective," he whispered coldly. Carter shoved the monster away, spinning around in the living room, desperately looking for a clue. The cottage was a dead end, but as Carter's eyes swept across the small wooden desk sitting in the corner of the room, he noticed a glowing, faint blue light emitting from a small, modern security monitor tucked behind a stack of books. Carter rushed over to the desk and pushed the books aside. The monitor was displaying a live, black-and-white closed-circuit video feed. It was wired directly to a camera hidden somewhere else on the island. The screen showed a small, circular, windowless room with thick, curved stone walls. It was the very bottom level of the abandoned lighthouse tower. Carter stared at the screen, his breath completely stopping in his throat. The room on the monitor was completely bare, save for a small mattress on the floor. But huddled in the corner of the dark, stone room, wrapped in a heavy blanket, was a figure. As Carter watched the live feed, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of the moment, the huddled figure slowly raised its head and looked directly into the hidden camera. Detective Carter stared at the glowing black-and-white monitor, his breath completely catching in his throat. The figure huddled on the small mattress in the dark, circular stone room looked up at the hidden camera, her pale face illuminated by a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. Even through the grainy, low-resolution video feed, and even through the heavy, devastating toll of 18 years of unimaginable captivity, Carter recognized her instantly. It was Harper Bennett. Carter dropped the security monitor, spinning around and shouting at the top of his lungs for the tactical team to move. He sprinted out of the warm keeper's cottage, completely ignoring the freezing coastal rain whipping across his face, and ran directly toward the towering, monolithic structure of the concrete lighthouse. Retired Sheriff Dawson was right behind him, his boots slipping on the wet rocks, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm of pure, desperate hope. They reached the massive, arched stone entryway at the base of the lighthouse tower. The original heavy wooden door had been completely removed and replaced by a solid, industrial steel vault door, secured with a complex digital keypad lock. Victor Sullivan had turned the foundation of the historic lighthouse into a completely impenetrable, soundproof subterranean prison. Carter didn't waste time trying to guess the code. He signaled the tactical breacher, who immediately attached small, highly specialized explosive breaching charges to the heavy steel hinges of the vault door. Carter and Dawson stepped back behind the stone wall of the cottage, covering their ears. "Breaching," the tactical officer yelled over the crashing waves. The explosion was a deafening, violent crack that shook the very foundation of the island. A massive cloud of gray concrete dust and smoke blew out into the freezing night air. The heavy steel vault door groaned, completely detached from its frame, and crashed heavily onto the stone floor inside. Carter drew his weapon, switching on his bright tactical flashlight, and stepped through the smoking doorway into the base of the lighthouse. The air inside the circular stone room was incredibly cold, smelling of stale ocean water, damp concrete, and deep isolation. The walls were several feet thick, originally designed to withstand hurricane-force waves, meaning absolutely no sound from the outside world had ever reached this room. In the far corner of the dark cell, huddled tightly against the curved stone wall, was Harper. She was incredibly frail, trembling violently from the sudden, terrifying explosion. She was wearing an oversized, faded wool sweater, holding her hands up to protect her sensitive eyes from the blinding white beams of the police flashlights. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away, expecting the monster to walk through the door and punish her. Carter immediately holstered his weapon and slowly lowered his flashlight, aiming the beam at the stone floor so he wouldn't blind her. He took off his heavy tactical helmet, exposing his face, and dropped to his knees a few feet away from her. "Harper," Carter whispered, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "My name is Detective Carter. We are the police. You are safe now. We are taking you home." Harper remained completely frozen against the wall. Her chest heaved with panicked, shallow breaths. She had spent 18 years living in absolute, suffocating terror, completely cut off from humanity. Her mind struggled to process the sudden rush of voices and the men in uniform. She slowly lowered her trembling hands and opened her eyes, staring at Detective Carter in the dim light. Sheriff Dawson stepped forward, dropping to his knees right next to Carter. The older man was openly weeping, tears streaming down his weathered face. He looked at the young woman he had spent nearly 2 decades searching for, his heart completely shattering at the sight of her condition, but swelling with an impossible, beautiful relief. "Harper," Dawson said, his voice cracking softly. "My name is Sheriff Dawson. I was on the beach the night you went missing. We never stopped looking for you." Harper stared at the older man, her pale, cracked lips trembling. For a long, agonizing moment, the heavy silence of the stone room pressed down on them. "My mother," Harper whispered, her voice incredibly weak and raspy, sounding like a fragile instrument that hadn't been played in years. "Is my mother, is Evelyn still out there?" Carter reached into his tactical vest. With trembling fingers, he pulled out the clear plastic evidence bag containing the heavy, tarnished silver compass necklace they had pulled from the muddy estuary just 2 days ago. He held it up in the soft light. "She has been waiting for you every single day," Carter said gently. "She told us that this compass would always help you find your way home. It worked, Harper. It brought us right to you." When Harper saw the silver compass, the thick, heavy wall of trauma and terror that she had built to survive for 18 years finally, completely shattered. A sound of absolute, agonizing emotional release tore from her throat. She lunged forward, collapsing into Detective Carter's chest, sobbing with a desperate, beautiful intensity. Carter wrapped his arms tightly around her small, fragile frame, holding her as she cried. Dawson placed a warm, protective hand on her back, his own tears falling freely onto the cold stone floor. The tactical medics rushed into the cell, gently wrapping Harper in thick, heated thermal blankets. They carefully placed her onto a portable stretcher, protecting her from the freezing coastal wind, and carried her out of the dark lighthouse tower. As the medics loaded Harper onto the waiting tactical boat, Victor Sullivan was being marched down the slippery stone stairs toward a separate police Zodiac. He was heavily handcuffed, his white hair blowing in the wind. When Victor saw the medics carrying the stretcher, proving that his ultimate, inescapable puzzle had been completely dismantled, the cold, arrogant smirk entirely vanished from his face. The monster realized that his absolute control was permanently broken. He looked away, staring down at the dark, churning water, finally understanding that his life was completely over. The tactical boat sped away from Blackwood Reef, leaving the dark, silent tomb of the lighthouse behind forever. Back on the mainland, Evelyn Bennett was sitting in the quiet, sterile waiting room of the Coastal Medical Center. Detective Carter had called her from the island the absolute second they breached the door, confirming the impossible miracle. Evelyn was entirely alone in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, her entire body shaking with an electric, overwhelming anticipation. Just before dawn, the heavy double doors of the emergency room burst open. A team of nurses and doctors rushed a stretcher down the hallway, surrounded by police officers. Evelyn stood up, her breath completely catching in her throat. She took a step forward, her legs feeling incredibly weak. The nurses stopped the stretcher just outside the private recovery room, allowing the mother to approach. Evelyn walked slowly toward the bed. The bright fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway illuminated the pale, exhausted face of the woman lying under the heavy white blankets. Harper was now 38 years old. Her hair was heavily streaked with gray, and her skin was incredibly pale. But when she turned her head on the pillow and looked up, Evelyn saw the exact same gentle, beautiful eyes that had looked through the camera lens 18 years ago. "Harper," Evelyn gasped, her voice breaking into a devastating, breathless sob. "Mom," Harper whispered, tears instantly flooding her eyes, her trembling hand reaching out from beneath the warm blankets. Evelyn collapsed against the side of the hospital bed, wrapping her arms around her daughter's head, burying her face into Harper's neck. They held each other with a desperate, crushing, fiercely protective intensity, crying so hard that the sound echoed down the quiet hospital corridor. Every single nurse, doctor, and police officer standing in the hallway had to look away to wipe their own eyes. It was a moment of profound, indescribable beauty, a bridge spanning 18 years of total darkness, completely illuminated by the raw, unstoppable power of a mother's love. In the days and weeks that followed the miraculous rescue, the complete, horrifying truth of Victor Sullivan's crimes was fully brought to light, answering the final, lingering questions of the long mystery. Victor was a deeply sadistic, highly organized predator who hunted in total isolation. On that freezing evening in March of 1995, he had been driving his dark blue pickup truck along the deserted coastal highway, looking for targets of opportunity. He parked behind the abandoned concrete watchtower, waiting in the shadows. When Harper walked down the beach alone, her camera slung over her shoulder, Victor ambushed her. He forced her into his truck at gunpoint, stealing her camera bag and burying it in the sand dunes miles away to intentionally mislead the police search efforts. He drove her back to his isolated scrapyard on the Blackwood estuary, locking her in the underground cinderblock cell beneath the pump house. For 3 years, Harper survived in that dark hole, carving her name into the wall with a rusted screw she had found on the floor, desperately leaving a breadcrumb just in case she didn't survive. But the most incredible, brilliant piece of the entire mystery was finally explained by Harper herself during a gentle, slow interview with Detective Carter in the hospital. Carter asked her how her silver compass necklace had ended up buried deep in the mud of the estuary, half a mile away from the scrapyard. Harper smiled weakly, looking down at the heavy silver locket now resting safely back around her neck. She explained that in 1998, when Victor decided to close the scrapyard and move her to the private island to avoid detection, he heavily bound her hands and feet and placed her in the bottom of a small, covered aluminum boat for the transport. As Victor steered the boat through the dark, winding channels of the Blackwood estuary in the middle of the night, Harper realized it might be her last chance to ever leave a clue. Working desperately in the dark, she managed to loosen her bound hands just enough to reach up and unclasp her silver necklace. As the boat passed near the muddy banks of a shallow inlet, Harper secretly rolled to the edge of the boat and dropped the heavy silver compass over the side, listening as it splashed silently into the dark water. She knew the mud would swallow it. She knew it was a desperate, nearly impossible gamble, but she threw it away, hoping that someday, somehow, the compass would do exactly what it was designed to do, point the way back to her. And 18 years later, a massive coastal hurricane dredged the bottom of that exact inlet, exposing the silver necklace to the sun, leading a metal detectorist right to the clue that ultimately unraveled a monster's entire empire. It was an act of quiet, brilliant defiance that completely saved her own life. Faced with the undeniable physical evidence found at the scrapyard, the secret cell under the pump house, and the horrific reality of the island lighthouse, Victor Sullivan's high-priced defense attorneys advised him not to fight. Terrified of facing a highly publicized trial and a guaranteed death penalty from a furious jury, Victor officially pleaded guilty to first-degree kidnapping, false imprisonment, and aggravated assault. The judge showed absolutely no mercy, stating on the record that Victor had stolen the best years of a young woman's life for his own sadistic control. Victor Sullivan was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was heavily shackled and transferred to a maximum security state penitentiary, destined to spend the rest of his natural life locked in a tiny, concrete cell, suffering the exact same absolute isolation he had forced upon Harper. The recovery process for Harper Bennett was not quick or easy. Re-entering a modern world that had advanced by nearly 2 decades was incredibly overwhelming. She had to learn how to use a smartphone, navigate a busy street, and slowly rebuild her physical strength. But she was never alone for a single second. Evelyn moved them into a quiet, beautiful home near the mountains, far away from the ocean. Maya, carrying 18 years of heavy guilt, finally found peace when she drove up to the mountains and hugged her best friend for the first time since that cold afternoon in the cabin. Harper completely forgave her instantly, refusing to let the darkness of the past ruin the light of their future. On a bright, crisp morning a year after her rescue, Harper walked out onto the wooden back porch of their new home. The sun was shining warmly through the green leaves of the towering oak trees. She lifted a brand new digital camera to her eye, adjusting the focus on a small, delicate bluebird resting on a nearby branch. She smiled, feeling the heavy silver compass resting against her chest, and pressed the shutter button, finally capturing the quiet, beautiful moments she had always loved so deeply. The story of the college student who vanished on a dark beach, only to be found 18 years later because of a lost silver necklace, became a legendary story of survival and determination. It stands as a chilling reminder that there are predators who hide in the desolate, forgotten corners of the world, waiting patiently in the shadows. But far more importantly, it is an unbreakable, unforgettable testament to the sheer power of hope and the absolute resilience of the human spirit. A monster can lock a young woman away in the dark. He can bury the truth under concrete floors, transport his secrets across the ocean, and build iron doors to hide his crimes from the world. But love, just like the needle of a compass, cannot be destroyed by time or distance. It waits in the freezing mud, it survives the violent hurricanes, and eventually it always breaks the surface, proving that even after the darkest, longest night, you can always find your way home.